My son sent me a message late on a Friday night. He told me not to come to his house anymore because his wife wanted peace. I am a man of my word, so I accepted his request quietly and gave them absolute peace. The very next morning he was banging on my front door. Before I explain exactly how a single text message systematically dismantled an entire lifestyle in less than 12 hours, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to teach an entitled family member a hard lesson about where their money actually comes from. I am Calvin Ridge. I am 65 years old, and I have spent the last 4 decades building a heavy machinery logistics firm from a single used flatbed truck into a national enterprise. I do not deal in drama. I deal in contracts, manifests, and supply chains. My world operates on cause and effect, on precise calculations and undeniable facts. It was 8:45 on a Friday evening. I was sitting alone in my home office. The room is paneled in dark walnut silent, except for the low hum of my desktop server cooling fans and the occasional ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I had a glass of sparkling water on my desk and a thick stack of quarterly logistics manifests spread out before me. I was meticulously cross-referencing diesel fuel expenditures for our Midwest trucking routes. It was a standard, highly productive and quiet end to a long week. My cell phone chimed, vibrating heavily against the polished mahogany surface of my desk. I put down my reading glasses and picked up the device. It was a text message from my 35-year-old son, Justin. Earlier that week, Justin had called and specifically asked me to bring over my vintage set of golf clubs. He wanted to display them in his home office to impress a prospective corporate client he was hosting for brunch on Saturday morning. I had spent an hour carefully cleaning the irons and had placed the heavy leather bag by my front door, fully intending to drop them off on my way to the hardware store later that evening. I swiped the screen to open his message. It read, "Vanessa is having her influencer launch party tonight. Do not come by to drop off the golf clubs. You stress her out. We want peace." I sat back in my heavy leather chair and read the words a second time, letting the sheer audacity of the statement settle into the quiet room. Vanessa is my daughter-in-law. She is 32 years old, aggressively image-obsessed, and treats my existence as an unfortunate tax she must occasionally endure to maintain access to my bank accounts. She had never worked a single day in our family business. She had never loaded a truck, negotiated a vendor contract, or balanced a payroll ledger. Yet she felt perfectly comfortable dictating who was allowed to step foot on the property that I entirely paid for. I did not throw my phone against the wall. I did not call Justin to yell at him or demand an apology. I do not waste my energy on emotional outbursts. In the logistics industry, when a transport route becomes inefficient, excessively costly, or toxic to the overall bottom line, you do not argue with the road. You simply cut the route. Justin and Vanessa stated clearly that they wanted peace. They felt my mere presence delivering a favor they asked for was a stress factor. I decided in that exact moment to grant them their wish completely and without hesitation. I opened the keypad and typed my response, ensuring my grammar was perfectly cold and precise. Understood. Peace granted. I hit send, placed the phone face down on the quiet desk, and slid the diesel manifests to the side. I turned my attention to my primary computer monitor and opened a secure, encrypted browser window. I logged into my master banking terminal using my biometric thumb drive. Justin and Vanessa lived in a sprawling 6-bedroom modern farmhouse in an incredibly affluent gated suburb. They drove imported luxury cars, hosted lavish catered parties, and projected an image of immense self-made entrepreneurial success on their social media channels. The stark reality of their existence was hidden in the digital ledgers currently glowing on my screen. I was the silent guarantor of their entire lifestyle. The first asset I located within the banking portal was the corporate credit account. Justin and Vanessa each possessed a high-limit platinum corporate card legally issued under the umbrella of my legacy equipment leasing company. They used these corporate cards to seamlessly fund their daily lives, fraudulently writing off designer clothing, Hall's expensive cosmetic procedures, and lavish dinners as business entertainment and marketing expenses. I clicked on the User Management tab within the portal. I located the profile labeled Justin Ridge. I clicked the red button marked Revoke Access. I then scrolled down and located the profile labeled Vanessa Ridge. I clicked Revoke Access. The screen refreshed instantly. The heavy metal plastic cards currently sitting in their designer wallets were now completely useless pieces of trash. Next, I navigated to the automated clearinghouse directives. A property the size of theirs requires massive monthly capital just to keep the infrastructure functioning. I pulled up the municipal property tax escrow account. I canceled the scheduled quarterly payment, effectively putting their address in immediate arrears with the county. I moved steadily down the list to the municipal utility grid. Their modern farmhouse featured a heated saltwater pool, extensive exterior landscape lighting, and a massive commercial-grade central air conditioning system that ran constantly. I deleted the automatic draft mandate for the local power company. Finally, I found the most critical component necessary for Vanessa to host a successful social media influencer launch party: the high-speed gigabit fiber optic internet connection. I did not just cancel the upcoming payment for the internet bill. I logged directly into the telecommunications provider portal using the master administrative credentials. Vanessa relied heavily on a fully integrated smart home system. Her custom lighting, her wireless sound system streaming the party music, and her caterer's digital point-of-sale systems all required active broadband to function. I selected the administrative option for immediate service suspension due to account restructuring. A warning box popped up on the screen, advising me that executing this command would instantly disconnect the residents and that restoring service could take up to 48 business hours. I clicked confirm without blinking. I checked the brass clock on my wall. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the evening. In the short span of 15 minutes, the digital umbilical cord that had entirely sustained my son and his wife for the entirety of their marriage was permanently and legally severed. I closed the browser, finished the last sip of my sparkling water, and calmly returned to calculating my diesel fuel manifests. The house remained perfectly quiet for the rest of the night. I slept incredibly well, enjoying the peace Justin had requested. At exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, the heavy brass knocker on my front door began to slam repeatedly, echoing violently through my quiet foyer. I pulled the heavy front door open. The crisp Saturday morning air rolled into the foyer. I held a ceramic mug of black coffee in my right hand. Standing on my front porch was my 35-year-old son. Justin looked absolutely terrible. He was pale. A sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, catching the early morning sunlight. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian silk shirt that he had undoubtedly charged to my corporate account. The expensive fabric was heavily wrinkled, completely betraying the image of the flawless entrepreneur he tried so desperately to project to the world. Behind him, parked haphazardly in the center of my circular driveway, was a pristine black Porsche Cayenne. That vehicle was legally registered to my heavy machinery logistics firm as a fleet transport vehicle. Justin drove it as his personal grocery getter. The engine was still running. It emitted a low, powerful rumble that disrupted the quiet peace of my neighborhood. He had clearly sped the entire way here, terrified by the sudden collapse of his financial safety net. Justin did not say good morning. He did not ask how I was doing. He completely abandoned any basic pretense of respect or normal social greeting. He stepped forward, invading my personal space, his eyes wide and frantic. "The cards are declining," he blurted out. His voice was higher than normal, completely lacking its usual arrogant authority. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee. I looked past him, observing a blue jay landing on the edge of my stone fountain. I said nothing. I let the silence hang in the air, forcing him to fill the uncomfortable void. "Did you hear me?" Justin demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Every single payment is bouncing. The grocery delivery apps, the morning coffee, run the gas pump. Everything is locked. But that is not even the real problem. Vanessa has the elite event caterers setting up at our house right now for her wellness brand launch. I knew all about this wellness brand launch. For the past 6 months, Vanessa had been purchasing thousands of dollars of wholesale organic cosmetic creams. She was slapping her own custom-printed labels on the jars and claiming she had developed a revolutionary new skincare line. She had absolutely no background in dermatology biology or business management. It was entirely a vanity project. It was a massive financial sinkhole designed solely to generate aesthetic photographs for her social media followers. And now the illusion was collapsing in real time. "They need a $10,000 authorization hold right now," Justin continued. Panic was fully taking over his face. "The lead caterer is standing in my custom kitchen with a mobile card reader. He told Vanessa that if the $10,000 deposit does not clear in the next 15 minutes, he is pulling his entire crew. They will pack up the imported ice sculptures, the champagne towers, and the organic appetizers. They will walk right out the front door. Her investors will be arriving in 2 hours. Her influencer friends will be there with their cameras ready. She will be a complete laughingstock. You need to call the bank and lift the fraud lock immediately." I looked at my son. I saw a grown man who had never faced a single genuine consequence in his entire adult life. He honestly believed that the bank had simply made an administrative error. It had not even crossed his mind that the financial tap had been deliberately shut off. He was demanding a $10,000 rescue for a fake business while standing in a silk shirt. He did not pay for having driven here in a luxury car he did not own. When I was his age, I was working 16-hour shifts in a diesel garage, risking my own capital to buy my second flatbed truck. Justin was having a panic attack over champagne towers. I lowered my coffee mug. I maintained a perfectly relaxed posture. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the exact same measured tone I use when negotiating a bulk diesel contract with a difficult vendor. "I have been reading several interesting articles lately," I said calmly. "They all state that financial entanglements are the leading cause of interpersonal stress in modern families." Justin stared at me, completely derailed by my response. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "I am talking about caterers walking out. I am talking about total public humiliation. Get your phone out and call the bank." I shook my head slowly. "I cannot do that, Justin. Last night you sent me a very clear message. You explicitly stated that my presence was a source of stress for your wife. You requested peace. As a father, it is my duty to ensure the well-being of my family. I realized that my ongoing financial subsidies were creating an unhealthy dynamic between us. I have removed the stress. The corporate cards are permanently revoked." The blood drained completely from Justin's face. The reality of the situation finally pierced through his impenetrable wall of entitlement. He took a step back. His mouth opened and closed as he tried to process the catastrophic weight of my words. "You canceled the cards," he whispered. The panic in his eyes turned into absolute terror. "You cut us off. Today, on the most important day of Vanessa's career. Are you insane? We have nothing in our personal checking accounts. Everything is tied to those corporate accounts. You are going to ruin us over a text message." I did not ruin you, I replied evenly. I simply stopped paying for you. There is a very distinct difference. A successful entrepreneur should have no problem covering a $10,000 catering bill for their own product launch. I suggest you go back home and figure out how to finance your own life. Justin lunged forward. He grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door, attempting to force his way inside my home. I need the emergency checkbook, he yelled. All pretense of civility was completely gone. I know you keep the blank corporate checks in the wall safe in your study. I am a partner in the legacy leasing firm. I have legal right to those funds. I am walking into that study, I am writing a check to the caterers right now, and you are not going to stop me. He was not a partner. 10 years ago, I gave him a junior advisory title on a defunct equipment leasing subsidiary, just to bolster his resume so he could qualify for a premium country club membership. He had zero signing authority. But in his desperate, panicked mind, he was clinging to any delusion of power he could find. I stepped firmly into the doorway, physically blocking his path. My decades of working in the heavy machinery yards had given me a physical solidity that his gym-curated physique could not match. I looked him dead in the eye. My expression hardened into absolute stone. You are a guest on my property, I said. My voice dropped an octave, carrying a severe warning that even he could not ignore. And your invitation has just expired. Justin froze. His grip loosened on the brass handle. He had never seen me look at him like this. He was used to the quiet, accommodating father who quietly signed the checks to keep the peace. He did not recognize the ruthless businessman standing before him. I stepped back into the foyer and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The solid wood closed with a heavy, definitive thud. The automatic deadbolt engaged instantly with a sharp, metallic click. I stood in the quiet hallway, taking another sip of my coffee. I did not walk away. I moved quietly to the side window, peering through the sheer curtains to observe the front porch. Justin was standing exactly where I left him. He was staring at the closed door in sheer disbelief. His hands were visibly shaking. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, likely intending to call Vanessa to tell her the money was gone and the caterers were going to walk. But he stopped. He looked at the heavy oak door, then glanced around the quiet, manicured neighborhood. A dark, reckless anger suddenly washed over his pale face. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and reached deep into his jacket. He pulled out a silver keyring. Hanging from it was the emergency spare key to my house. It was a key I had given him 5 years ago, strictly for medical emergencies. He gripped the key tightly, stepping toward the lock, fully intending to bypass my authority, break into my private study, and steal a blank corporate check to save his fragile, fabricated empire. Justin stood on my front porch, staring at the solid oak door. He pulled the silver emergency key from his tailored pants pocket. This was the key I had given him 5 years ago, with strict instructions to only use it in the event of a medical emergency. He jammed the metal into the heavy brass lock and attempted to turn it. The key slid in perfectly, but the mechanism did not budge. He jiggled the handle and forced his weight against the wood, his knuckles turning white from the strain. The tumblers inside the lock remained completely frozen in place. He did not know that at 5 o'clock this morning, before the sun even crested the horizon, I had a private security contractor at my property. A discreet van had arrived while the entire neighborhood was still asleep. The technician had methodically removed the cylinders from the front door, the back patio entrance, and the garage service entrance. He had repinned every single tumbler to a completely new configuration. Justin was operating under the arrogant assumption that his access to my life and my home was a permanent right etched in stone. He was currently learning the harsh reality that access is merely a privilege that can be permanently revoked with a simple phone call and a minor maintenance fee. He slammed his open palm against the wood in pure frustration. He was locked out of the house, locked out of the bank accounts, and running entirely out of time. He turned away from the door and marched down the brick steps toward the black Porsche Cayenne parked in the center of my driveway. I watched him from the safety of my darkened office window. I could see the desperate gears turning in his head. He needed $10,000 in liquid cash immediately to stop the elite caterers from walking out on his wife and her ridiculous product launch. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his expensive silk jacket. I knew exactly what piece of paper he was touching. 6 months ago, my corporate accountant had noticed a minor discrepancy in the vehicle filing cabinet at the main logistics headquarters. Someone had accessed the drawer and made a high-resolution color photocopy of the pink slip title for that exact Porsche. I knew without a doubt it was Justin. He had copied the title to keep as a fraudulent proof of ownership, saving it as a desperate backup plan for a rainy day. That day had officially arrived. He was going to drive my company car to a high-interest title loan office located in a rundown strip mall on the industrial edge of the city. It was the kind of predatory lending operation that did not ask questions as long as the paperwork looked remotely legitimate. He planned to slide that stolen photocopy across a dirty laminate counter pawn, the luxury vehicle for a fraction of its actual market value stuff, a duffel bag with dirty cash, and race back to his neighborhood to save face in front of a group of internet influencers. He was entirely willing to commit corporate fraud and risk severe federal legal consequences just to maintain a fake image of wealth. It was the frantic, sloppy thinking of a desperate man who had never actually built anything of value from the ground up. He yanked the heavy driver's side door open and dropped into the premium leather seat. He slammed the door shut, sealing himself inside the soundproof cabin. I watched him press his expensive leather shoe against the brake pedal and push the engine start button on the dashboard. The powerful engine did not roar to life. Instead, the central console illuminated with a harsh, glaring red warning light. A digital message flashed across the navigation screen in bold block letters. The message simply read, "System locked." He pressed the start button again, mashing it repeatedly with his thumb. Nothing happened. He pumped the gas pedal and slammed his fist against the steering column. The car remained completely dead. The transmission was electronically frozen, and the fuel line valve was magnetically sealed shut. Justin threw his head back against the headrest, his mouth opening in a silent scream of absolute rage that I could not hear through the thick glass of my office window. I stood quietly in the shadows of my office, holding a small black plastic fob in my right hand. In the heavy machinery logistics industry, you do not simply trust your drivers with million-dollar assets out on the open road. You track them. You control them. Every single flatbed truck, heavy crane, and corporate transport vehicle in my fleet is equipped with military-grade telemetry modules. I can monitor tire pressure, engine temperature, and precise geographic location directly from my desktop server. The telemetry system I employ is not a standard civilian tracking device. It is a proprietary software suite designed to protect heavy payload cargo across state lines. If a vehicle is reported stolen or deviates from an authorized route, I can execute a remote kill switch. When I press the red button on that fob, an encrypted signal is sent directly to the electronic control unit of the vehicle. It immediately severs the connection between the ignition switch and the starter motor. Simultaneously, it triggers a magnetic block in the primary fuel line, starving the engine of combustion. Justin thought he was driving his own personal luxury vehicle. He forgot that he was driving a piece of strictly managed corporate equipment. The moment he had walked away from the car to knock on my front door, I had pressed the button on the fob. I had permanently stranded him in my own driveway. He had absolutely no way to flee the property. He had no way to reach the title loan shark across town. Most importantly, he had no way to pay the people currently dismantling Vanessa and her fabricated launch party. I watched him sit in the dead vehicle for several long minutes. The reality of his complete powerlessness was finally sinking into his mind. The financial safety net was not just gone. The entire ground beneath his feet had been completely removed. He grabbed his smartphone from the passenger seat and began tapping furiously on the screen. 10 minutes later, a standard economy ride-share vehicle pulled up to the curb at the end of my driveway. Justin stepped out of the useless luxury SUV. He was so consumed by panic that he left the heavy driver's side door hanging wide open. He did not look back at my house. He climbed into the back of the cheap sedan, and the driver pulled away, disappearing down the quiet suburban street. I remained in my office. I did not go outside to close the car door. I simply sat down at my mahogany desk and returned to reviewing my quarterly fuel manifests. The morning remained incredibly quiet. I watched the neighborhood landscapers meticulously trim the hedges across the street. The heavy tension seemed to completely dissipate into the crisp air. I knew Justin was likely arriving back at his house right now, stepping into the absolute chaos of angry caterers and a furious wife. But the consequences of his actions were already in motion, spiraling completely out of his control. Exactly 2 hours later, the heavy rumble of a municipal engine broke the neighborhood silence. A black and white county police cruiser turned the corner and slowly rolled to a stop at the end of my driveway. The light bar on the roof was flashing silently, casting harsh red and blue reflections across the dark paint of the disabled Porsche. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of the cruiser. They adjusted their heavy-duty belts and began walking deliberately up my front walkway. They were not here on a routine neighborhood patrol. They were here regarding a reported stolen vehicle. I stood in the quiet foyer and observed the 2 county police officers through the side window before slowly opening the heavy oak door. They were fully uniformed, standing with the rigid posture of men who were prepared for a difficult confrontation. The morning sun reflected off their silver badges. The taller officer stepped forward and asked if I was Calvin Ridge. I nodded politely and kept my posture completely relaxed. I did not act surprised or defensive. In my decades of running a heavy machinery logistics empire, I have dealt with federal transport inspectors, highway patrolmen, and aggressive union auditors. A visit from the local police does not elevate my heart rate. The officer cleared his throat and stated that they were investigating a serious crime. He looked directly at me and said they had received a frantic emergency call from my daughter-in-law, Vanessa Ridge. According to the officer, Vanessa had reported that a black Porsche Cayenne was stolen from her residential driveway earlier this morning. The officer explained that the vehicle tracking system, or a neighborhood traffic camera, had pinged the car in my immediate vicinity. They were here to ask if I had seen the vehicle or if I knew why it might be parked in my driveway. I listened to the officer outline the situation, and I felt a cold wave of absolute clarity wash over me. I instantly understood exactly what had happened across town. Vanessa had watched her meticulously planned wellness brand launch collapse into total ruin. She had watched the elite caterers pack up their expensive organic appetizers and their imported ice sculptures because the $10,000 deposit had bounced. She had faced the ultimate social humiliation. In a state of pure panic and desperate greed, she had concocted a remarkably stupid plan. She noticed that Justin had taken the Porsche and had not returned. She decided to call the police and report the luxury vehicle as stolen. Her twisted logic was entirely transparent to a businessman like me. She assumed that if she filed an official police report, she could immediately file a massive claim with the automotive insurance provider. She thought she could secure an emergency cash payout to salvage her lifestyle and cover her immediate debts. She was attempting to commit blatant insurance fraud to generate quick liquid cash. She honestly believed she was clever enough to manipulate the county police department and a corporate insurance underwriter on the same morning. I did not raise my voice or show any anger toward the officers. I simply stepped aside and opened the door wider. I told the officers that the vehicle in question was indeed parked in my driveway, and that they were more than welcome to come inside to discuss the matter. The officers exchanged a brief look of surprise. People accused of possessing stolen property do not typically invite law enforcement into their homes with a calm smile. They stepped into my foyer and removed their uniform hats. I guided them down the hallway and into my dark, walnut-paneled office. I offered them a seat, but they politely declined, choosing to stand near my mahogany desk. I sat down in my heavy leather chair and woke up my primary computer monitor. I told the officers that there had been a monumental misunderstanding, but that I was not the one who had misunderstood the law. I explained that I own a national heavy equipment logistics firm, and that the black Porsche Cayenne sitting in my driveway was not a personal vehicle. It was a registered corporate fleet transport asset. I opened my encrypted fleet management software and turned the large monitor so both officers could clearly see the screen. I told them that because my company transports millions of dollars of heavy machinery across state lines, I do not rely on standard civilian tracking. Every vehicle I own is equipped with military-grade telemetry modules. I clicked on the digital profile for the Porsche. A detailed map of the city appeared on the screen, accompanied by a dense column of timestamps and geographic coordinates. I pointed to the screen and walked the officers through the exact digital footprint of the vehicle. I showed them that at exactly 7 o'clock this morning, the engine was started at the precise address of Justin and Vanessa. The telemetry logs showed the car traveling at a high rate of speed down the interstate before pulling into my exact residential coordinates. I then showed them the final log entry, indicating that a remote engine immobilizer had been triggered from this very office. I looked at the lead officer and stated clearly that the car was not stolen by a stranger in the middle of the night. It was driven here by my son Justin, and I had remotely disabled it because he was no longer authorized to operate company equipment. The officers stared at the irrefutable digital evidence glowing on the monitor. The tracking data was precise down to the exact second and the exact foot, but I was not finished dismantling Vanessa and her web of lies. Telemetry data only proved who drove the car. I needed to prove that she had absolutely no legal right to report it missing in the first place. I unlocked the heavy fireproof drawer on the right side of my desk. I pulled out a thick manila folder labeled Corporate Transport Titles. I flipped through the heavy watermarked documents until I found the original pink slip for the black Porsche Cayenne. I placed the official state document squarely on the center of my desk and invited the officers to inspect it. I explained that Justin had recently made a fraudulent photocopy of this exact title to keep in his home safe, but the document on my desk was the sole legal original. The lead officer leaned forward and read the printed text. The registered owner was listed exclusively as my logistics corporation. Justin was not on the title. Vanessa was certainly not on the title. Neither of them had any legal ownership equity or authorized control over the asset. I sat back in my chair and looked at the two law enforcement officials. I laid out the stark reality of the situation. I told them that Vanessa Ridge had willfully dialed an emergency dispatch line and provided a false statement. She had claimed ownership of a vehicle she did not own and reported a theft that never occurred. I respectfully suggested that given her sudden financial distress, this was a calculated first step in a broader scheme to defraud our corporate insurance provider. The atmosphere in my quiet home office shifted instantly. The officers were no longer looking around my property for signs of stolen goods. They were staring at a neatly documented open and shut case of felony fraud. The taller officer slowly reached for the heavy black radio clipped to his tactical belt. He pressed the transmission button and contacted the central dispatch operator. His voice was completely devoid of its previous polite caution. It was now sharp and entirely professional. He requested to be patched through to the active warrant division. He stated that the stolen vehicle report, originating from the Ridge residence, was officially entirely fabricated. He then formally requested that an arrest warrant be drawn up immediately for Vanessa Ridge. The charges he listed echoed loudly in my quiet study. Filing a false police report, misuse of an emergency dispatch system, and attempted felony insurance fraud. The trap she had so arrogantly set for me had just snapped violently shut around her own neck. By midnight, my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, was sitting in a concrete holding cell at the county jail. The reality of a felony fraud charge is a very cold and unforgiving awakening. She was no longer a wealthy social media influencer hosting elite parties in a gated community. She was an inmate wearing standard-issue clothing, waiting for administrative processing. The bright fluorescent lights and the heavy steel doors were a stark contrast to the luxurious life she had demanded from me just a few hours prior. Across town, my son Justin was experiencing a completely different kind of nightmare. He was pacing the pristine hardwood floors of his massive modern farmhouse. The house was completely silent. The elite caterers were gone. The guests had never arrived. He was entirely isolated and desperate. He had spoken to a public defender who informed him that the county magistrate had set Vanessa's bail at $50,000. In the past, Justin would have simply reached into his designer wallet and swiped his platinum corporate card to secure a premium bail bondsman. If that failed, he would have called me playing the role of the panicked son to convince me to wire the funds immediately. But those safety nets no longer existed. His corporate cards were permanently dead. The luxury vehicle in his driveway was an immobilized brick of metal. His personal checking account was virtually empty because he and Vanessa spent every dollar they had on maintaining their fake public image. He was trapped in a multi-million-dollar home with absolutely no liquid capital. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of reckless courage. Justin realized he could not save his wife using legitimate means, so he decided to cross a legal line he had never crossed before. He retreated to his home office and opened his personal laptop. His hands were shaking as he stared at the glowing screen. He began to search his memory for any possible vulnerability in my corporate financial structure. 10 years ago, when I was restructuring my national logistics empire, I created a subsidiary equipment leasing company. It was a smaller limited liability corporation designed specifically to handle overflow contracts and short-term machinery rentals. At the time, I gave Justin a ceremonial title as a junior partner in that specific subsidiary. It was a vanity title meant to help him build his business resume and perhaps teach him a little bit about the family trade. He never actually did any real work, but his name was entered into the administrative database. The subsidiary was eventually absorbed into the main corporate umbrella, but the legacy accounting software remained active on a secure background server to maintain historical tax records. Justin remembered this digital backdoor. He searched through his old digital files and found his original login credentials. He typed the username and password into the secure legacy portal. He held his breath as the system authenticated his identity. The screen flashed and granted him access to the old financial dashboard. He was now looking directly at the internal routing numbers for my corporate payroll accounts. These accounts hold millions of dollars in liquid capital. They are designed specifically to pay my truck drivers, my diesel mechanics, and my administrative staff across the entire country. Justin knew he did not have physical check-signing authority on any of my active accounts. However, he remembered that the legacy system utilized a digital signature stamp for processing automated vendor payouts and emergency equipment purchases. He navigated to the external wire transfer menu. His heart was pounding in his chest as he filled out the digital authorization form. He did not just transfer the $50,000 required for the bail bondsman. greed and panic completely took over his judgment. He decided to take extra capital to secure his own immediate future. He typed in a transfer request for exactly $60,000. He did not route the money to a standard bail agency. He routed the funds to be sent directly to a private legal retainer account, belonging to a defense attorney he had found online. He hoped this would secure a high-priced lawyer for Vanessa and leave him with $10,000 in liquid cash to survive the weekend. He carefully applied my digital signature stamp to the bottom of the authorization form. He stared at the submit button for a long moment, knowing that clicking it would constitute a major federal crime. He clicked submit. The computer screen buffered for a few seconds before displaying a green confirmation message. The wire transfer had been successfully initiated and was pending final bank clearance. Justin closed his laptop and let out a deep, heavy breath of relief. He leaned back in his expensive office chair and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted me. In his mind, I was just an old-fashioned businessman who only reviewed the physical accounting ledgers at the end of every month. He calculated that he had at least 3 full weeks to figure out a permanent solution. He thought he could invent a convincing lie, secure his wife and somehow put the money back, or bury the transaction in administrative red tape before I ever noticed the missing $60,000. He walked into his kitchen, poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, and finally sat down, believing the immediate crisis was completely resolved. He was completely wrong about how I run my business. I do not wait for the end of the month to understand the financial health of my logistics empire. When you manage a massive payroll that supports hundreds of working families, you do not rely on outdated manual reviews. You protect your assets with the best technology available. My entire financial network is constantly monitored by a highly sophisticated artificial intelligence anomaly detection protocol. This advanced system analyzes every single transaction in real time. It compares every wire transfer against decades of historical spending patterns, vendor contracts, and authorized user locations. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I was sleeping soundly in the master bedroom of my home. The absolute silence of the dark house was suddenly broken by a sharp, piercing alarm echoing from my nightstand. It was not a standard text message chime or a regular phone call ringtone. It was a customized high-priority alert generated directly by my secure corporate server. I opened my eyes and reached for my smartphone. The screen was glowing a bright, harsh red in the pitch-black room. I sat up in bed and unlocked the device. I opened the secure banking application to view the notification. The artificial intelligence system had immediately flagged a massive unauthorized liquidity drain originating from the legacy payroll account. The digital alert provided a complete forensic breakdown of the transaction. It detailed the exact transfer amount of $60,000. It listed the destination routing number belonging to the private legal retainer. Most importantly, it identified the specific user terminal and internet protocol address that had initiated the request. The artificial intelligence had recognized that a dormant user profile belonging to my son had suddenly accessed a legacy portal in the middle of the night. It recognized that he had attempted to move a massive sum of money to an unknown external account using an automated digital stamp. I sat alone in the dark, staring at the glowing red text on my phone. The feeling of betrayal was profound, but my business instincts immediately took over. My son had not just made a poor financial decision in a moment of panic. He had actively committed federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement against his own father. He had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. I sat in the dark master bedroom holding my smartphone. The red warning light from the artificial intelligence security alert cast a faint, ominous glow across the heavy blankets. A normal father waking up to a notification of a massive theft committed by his own child might have immediately dialed 911 to report the crime. A normal father might have called his son in a fit of rage, demanding answers and threatening severe police action. I am not a normal father, and I do not make decisions based on temporary emotional spikes. I have spent my entire life building a national logistics empire, and I understand that emotional reactions only create unnecessary vulnerabilities. Calling the local authorities would have triggered a clumsy and highly public investigation. It would have allowed Justin to play the victim and manipulate the narrative to his advantage. I needed a surgical response. I needed total, absolute control over the situation before Justin even realized his digital theft had been detected. I did not call the police. I opened my encrypted contacts list and called Nolan Foster. Nolan is not a friendly neighborhood family lawyer who handles polite domestic disputes and simple estate planning. He is my primary corporate proxy attorney. He is a ruthless, brilliant strategist who protects my business from hostile takeovers, aggressive union litigation, and predatory competitors. Nolan operates with a level of cold, calculating efficiency that perfectly matches my own approach to life. When my phone dialed his secure private line at 2:15 in the morning, he answered on the very second ring. His voice was completely clear and sharp, showing no signs of sleep. I did not need to explain the emotional weight of the situation or express any parental disappointment. I simply told him that a dormant legacy payroll account had been breached internally. I explained that an unauthorized wire transfer of $60,000 had been initiated using a duplicated digital signature stamp belonging to me. I gave him the routing numbers, the timestamp, and the destination account information. Nolan simply said he would handle it immediately, and he hung up the phone. While Justin was presumably sleeping soundly in his massive, expensive house, believing he had successfully stolen from his father, my legal and forensic accounting teams were quietly going to war. For the next 4 hours, I did not pace the floor or worry about the outcome. I went into my kitchen, brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, and watched the sun slowly rise over the quiet suburban neighborhood. I knew that Nolan was utilizing his extensive network of financial investigators to peel back the deceptive layers of Justin's desperate transaction. My son thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he was leaving a digital footprint the size of a commercial transport truck. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, my secure line rang. I picked up the receiver and listened to the steady, confident voice of Nolan Foster. He had completely dismantled the digital trail in record time. Nolan explained that the routing number Justin had entered did not belong to a private legal retainer, as it had been falsely labeled on the authorization form. Justin had attempted to disguise the destination by routing the funds through a series of complex shell companies meant to look like legitimate defense attorneys operating in the state. But Nolan has high-level access to clearinghouse tracking data that easily bypasses basic consumer masking techniques. He told me the final destination of the $60,000 was an offshore holding account registered to a man named Gavin Russo. The name dropped into the quiet morning air like a heavy lead weight. Gavin Russo is not a lawyer. He is not a licensed bail bondsman. He is a very well-known shadow financier who operates far outside the boundaries of the law. I knew exactly who he was because in the heavy machinery transport business, you occasionally hear hushed whispers about the dangerous men who fund the dark markets of the city. Russo runs illegal high-stakes offshore gambling rings. He provides massive, unregulated lines of credit to wealthy individuals who want to play poker and place bets outside the watchful eyes of the Internal Revenue Service and federal regulators. The pieces of the puzzle instantly locked together in my mind, forming a picture of absolute cowardice and betrayal. Justin did not steal $60,000 to rescue his wife from a Concrete County holding cell. He did not care that Vanessa was currently sitting in the jail, facing serious felony fraud charges. He had abandoned her completely to her own fate. Justin had wired that money to save his own skin. He had been secretly feeding a massive gambling addiction using the false illusion of his extreme wealth to secure a dangerous line of credit from Russo. The bouncing of the platinum corporate cards the day before had not just ruined an influencer launch party. It had alerted Russo that Justin was suddenly insolvent and unable to pay his debts. Justin was trying to pay off an invisible, spiraling gambling debt to stop a violent shadow financier from coming to his home and breaking his legs. He had used his wife's arrest as a convenient mental excuse to commit corporate embezzlement. But his true motivation was raw, pathetic self-preservation. He had betrayed my trust to steal the money, and he had betrayed his wife by leaving her to face the criminal justice system completely alone. He was willing to let her take the fall while he attempted to cover his own illicit tracks. I asked Nolan what the current status of the wire transfer was. Nolan explained that international wire transfers involving large sums of liquid cash do not clear instantly. They are held in a digital clearinghouse for verification before the final release of funds to the receiving institution. The money was currently suspended in a digital transit corridor, waiting for the banks to open. I told Nolan to drop the hammer and stop the money. Nolan did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately contacted the Executive Fraud Division at the primary clearinghouse. He utilized my legal standing as the majority shareholder of the logistics firm to file an emergency intercept order. He officially flagged the $60,000 transfer as an act of suspected corporate embezzlement and domestic identity theft. Within 5 minutes, the bank locked the funds entirely. The money was violently yanked out of the transfer process and frozen in a secure federal holding account, pending a full criminal investigation. It would not go to Justin, and it absolutely would not go to Gavin Russo. The trap I had meticulously set was now perfectly complete. I thanked Nolan for his excellent work and ended the call. I stood by my kitchen window and looked out at the bright morning sky. Justin was going to wake up in a few hours, expecting to see a cleared transaction and a zero balance on his deadly debt. Instead, he was going to log into that legacy portal and find a bright red banking notification informing him that the funds had been seized by federal banking authorities. I had systematically stripped away every single layer of protection he had ever relied upon. His limitless corporate credit was permanently dead. His luxury transportation was disabled and sitting uselessly in my driveway. His wife was locked in a county jail with no legal representation and no bail money coming to save her. And now, because of his own greed and unbelievable stupidity, his final desperate lifeline had been completely severed. Justin was left standing in a massive empty house completely exposed with an unfunded debt to an incredibly dangerous man who was not known for his patience or his mercy. The insulated bubble of wealth and entitlement had finally popped, leaving my son to face the brutal, violent reality of the world he had created for himself. I left my quiet suburban home and drove directly to my primary logistics yard located on the sprawling, industrial outskirts of the city. This yard is the real engine of my wealth and the absolute center of my power. It is a massive 50-acre concrete compound filled with heavy steel shipping containers, towering diesel cranes, and endless rows of flatbed transport trucks. The air here always carries the thick, heavy scent of engine oil and hot asphalt. It is an unforgiving environment built entirely on hard physical labor, precise operational schedules, and undeniable results. I do not play games in this space. I was sitting in my elevated glass-walled office overlooking the main loading bay when I saw a vehicle approaching that clearly did not belong in my fleet. A heavily armored black luxury SUV pulled through the main security gates, completely bypassing the visitor checkpoint. It rolled slowly and deliberately across the active concrete yard, moving like a dark predator navigating through shallow water. I knew exactly who was inside that vehicle. Gavin Russo had woken up to discover that his $60,000 wire transfer had been permanently frozen by a federal clearinghouse. He was a dangerous man who had just been denied his money, and he was not going to waste his valuable time hunting a weak, panicked target like my son. He knew Justin was broke. He was coming straight to the source of the wealth. The black SUV parked aggressively at the base of my exterior metal staircase, blocking an active loading zone. 3 men stepped out into the morning sun. 2 of them were massive, imposing enforcers wearing cheap, dark suits stretched tight over thick, muscular frames. They were men designed strictly to intimidate and inflict severe physical pain. The 3rd man was Gavin Russo. He was sharply dressed in a custom-tailored suit, but he carried himself with the cold, coiled energy of a violent street thug who had simply learned how to launder his money through offshore accounts. I watched them march heavily up the metal staircase. They did not bother knocking on the thick steel door of my office. They simply pushed it open and walked inside uninvited. The 2 enforcers immediately spread out, flanking the heavy door and completely blocking my only exit. They crossed their massive arms and stared at me, trying to project an aura of absolute physical dominance and terror. I did not stand up from my chair. I did not reach for the silent security panic button mounted under my desk. I simply closed the transport manifest I was reviewing and looked directly at Russo. Russo walked slowly toward my large mahogany desk. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a small black leather notebook. He tossed it carelessly onto the center of my desk. The heavy ledger landed with a dull, threatening thud. He leaned forward, placing both of his hands firmly on the edge of my desk, attempting to invade my personal space and force me to look up at him. He spoke with a quiet, raspy voice that carried a very clear and practiced threat. He told me that my son Justin owed him a very considerable sum of money. He explained that Justin had attempted to wire him a partial payment earlier this morning, but the funds had been abruptly intercepted and frozen by my corporate lawyers. Russo looked me dead in the eye and said he did not care about bank holds, legal maneuvers, or family drama. He said he operated in a world where debts are settled immediately and permanently. He then attempted to leverage my pride. He told me that a man of my extreme wealth and high stature in the local business community should want to protect his family name at all costs. He expected the wealthy father to step up, honor the family reputation, and quietly settle the illicit debts of his reckless son. He told me I had exactly 24 hours to unfreeze the wire transfer and pay the remaining balance in untraceable cash, or my son would suffer severe physical consequences that could not be reversed. I looked at the black ledger sitting on my desk, and then I looked back at the shadow financier standing before me. I did not blink, and I did not show a single ounce of fear. Throughout my career, I have negotiated brutal contracts with ruthless union bosses and defended my empire against aggressive corporate raiders. A criminal making empty threats in my own office was not going to break my composure. I kept my voice incredibly calm and perfectly level. I told Russo that he had made a severe tactical error by stepping foot onto my commercial property. I explained that my logistics company holds massive, lucrative federal contracts, transporting heavy machinery for critical infrastructure projects across the entire country. Because of these federal contracts, my entire financial network is heavily and constantly monitored by federal auditors, the Department of Transportation, and the Internal Revenue Service. Every single dollar that moves through my corporate accounts is tracked and analyzed by powerful government agencies. I looked directly into his eyes and told him that if he attempted to extort me or force a payment from my legitimate corporate accounts, he would not just be dealing with a local police department. He would instantly expose his entire shadow gambling syndicate to a massive coordinated investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and federal money laundering task forces. I explained that trying to squeeze me for his money was the absolute fastest way to get his entire illegal empire dismantled and land himself in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. I told him that family honor is earned through hard work and integrity, not bought with extortion money, to cover up the crimes of a weak man. Russo stopped leaning on my desk. He stood up straight, and his confident, arrogant smirk completely disappeared. He was a violent criminal, but he was not stupid. He instantly recognized the reality of mutually assured destruction. He knew I was telling the absolute truth, and he realized he had absolutely no leverage over me. I was not a terrified suburban father who would blindly hand over cash to protect a spoiled child from the consequences of his own actions. I was a fortress that he could not breach. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. I placed it on the smooth wood right next to his threatening black ledger. I told him that I would not pay a single dime of my son's illicit gambling debt. I told him that Justin's problems were entirely his own creation, and he would have to face the music alone. I pushed the manila folder across the desk toward Russo. I explained that inside that folder was a highly detailed professional valuation of the massive luxury estate where Justin currently resides. I told him the folder contained the exact market value of the imported Italian furniture, the modern art collection, the high-end electronics, and the designer jewelry currently sitting unguarded inside that house. I looked Russo in the eye and gave him a piece of highly valuable free advice. I told him that his money was not in my bank accounts, but it was sitting right there inside that gated community. I suggested he take his men, leave my commercial property immediately, and go collect his debt directly from the boy who actually owes it. I remained in my office at the logistics yard and opened the primary security application on my desktop monitor. Because my son lived in a massive estate that was entirely funded and legally owned by my corporate trust, I had long ago installed discrete high-definition security cameras covering the exterior perimeter and the main entryways of the property. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and watched the live feed as Gavin Russo and his men arrived at the gated community. They did not stop at the security kiosk. The heavy armored SUV simply plowed through the wooden barrier arm, shattering it into pieces before accelerating down the manicured street toward Justin's house. The black vehicle skidded to a halt on the pristine brick driveway. The two massive enforcers who had just tried to intimidate me in my own office stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. They were followed by a third man, a sharply dressed shadow attorney who handled illicit property transfers for the gambling syndicate. They walked up the sweeping front steps. They did not press the glowing doorbell. The lead enforcer simply raised his heavy boot and kicked the custom mahogany front door with enough force to shatter the reinforced hinges. The door flew inward, crashing against the tiled floor of the grand foyer. Through the interior entryway camera, I watched my son jump backward in absolute terror. Justin had been pacing the empty house, desperately trying to figure out a plan, when the violent reality of his massive gambling debt literally kicked his front door down. The three men stepped over the splintered wood and surrounded him. The shadow attorney opened a leather briefcase and pulled out a blank property transfer contract. He told Justin that his father had respectfully declined to pay the debt. He explained that they were now here to collect the $60,000 directly from him. If Justin did not have the liquid cash, the attorney stated, they would immediately take possession of the multi-million-dollar estate to settle the ledger. If he refused to sign the property over, the two enforcers would begin breaking his bones one by one until his signature was on the paper. Justin was completely paralyzed by fear. He had spent his entire life playing the role of a powerful, wealthy entrepreneur, but faced with genuine physical violence, he instantly crumbled. He nodded frantically, tears streaming down his pale face. He told the men he would give them the house. He begged them not to hurt him and promised that the property was worth millions more than he owed. He turned and scrambled up the grand, sweeping staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. He ran into his master bedroom and threw open the door to his hidden wall safe. For the past 5 years, Justin and his wife Vanessa had lived under a very specific illusion. On the day they were married, I had handed them a thick legal envelope containing a watermarked document. I told them it was the paperwork for the house. They were so blinded by their own greed and entitlement that they never actually hired a lawyer to read the fine print. They simply locked it in their safe and spent the next 5 years boasting to their friends about the incredible real estate portfolio they were building. Justin ran back down the stairs, clutching the heavy parchment document. His hands were shaking violently as he handed it to the shadow attorney. He told the men that this was the original property deed and that he was ready to sign it over to Russo immediately, just to make them leave. He believed he was making a masterful sacrifice, trading a house he did not actually earn for his own physical safety. The shadow attorney took the document and adjusted his reading glasses. He scanned the dense legal paragraphs on the first page. He did not pull out a pen for Justin to sign. Instead, a cruel, mocking smile spread across the attorney's face. He looked up at my son and let out a harsh laugh. He threw the heavy parchment document right at Justin's chest, letting it flutter to the floor. The attorney told Justin that he was an absolute idiot. He explained that the document was not a property deed. It was a revocable lifetime tenancy agreement. Justin stared at the paper on the floor, completely unable to process the words. He stammered that it was impossible, and that I had given him the house as a wedding gift. The attorney coldly explained the brutal legal reality. The massive modern farmhouse was not owned by Justin. It was not owned by Vanessa. It was legally owned by an airtight, blind corporate trust that was entirely controlled by me. Justin had absolutely no equity, no ownership, and no legal right to transfer or sell a single brick of the property. He was nothing more than a glorified renter, living in a house he could not afford on a lease that I could terminate at any moment. Through the camera feed, I watched the horrifying realization wash over my son's face. The entire foundation of his fake life completely dissolved in a single second. He realized that he owned absolutely nothing. His cars were company assets. His credit cards were corporate accounts. His home was a legal fortress owned by his father. He had spent years projecting massive wealth while entirely ignoring the fact that he was completely empty-handed. The shadow attorney turned to the 2 massive enforcers. He told them that the house was legally untouchable, and attempting to seize it would trigger a massive federal response from my corporate lawyers. But he also remembered the detailed valuation folder I had handed Gavin Russo earlier that morning. I had explicitly provided them with an itemized list of the high-end luxury goods currently sitting inside the house. Goods that Justin had purchased using my money but were entirely untraceable. The attorney looked at Justin with absolute disgust. He told the enforcers to strip the house. He said they were going to take every single item of value to cover the debt and the interest. The 2 massive men immediately went to work. They did not care about preserving the pristine interior design. They walked into the living room and violently ripped the massive flat-screen televisions right off the walls, leaving gaping holes in the drywall. They grabbed the expensive modern art pieces that Vanessa had proudly displayed for her internet followers and smashed the frames to easily roll up the canvases. They marched into the kitchen and loaded their duffel bags with high-end imported espresso machines and silver cutlery. One of the enforcers walked heavily up the stairs to the master bedroom. Justin stood frozen in the foyer, completely powerless to stop him. A few minutes later, the enforcer returned carrying Vanessa's heavy velvet jewelry boxes. He had smashed open her vanity and taken every single designer watch, diamond necklace, and gold bracelet she had accumulated over the past 5 years. They carried the heavy Italian leather sofas out the front door and shoved them into the back of their armored vehicle. They took the designer rugs right out from under Justin's feet. The entire process took less than 30 minutes. When they were finally finished, the shadow attorney walked up to Justin, who was now standing on a bare wooden floor in an empty, echoing room. The attorney patted Justin hard on the cheek. He told Justin that his gambling debt was officially settled, but recommended that he never step foot in another casino for the rest of his life. The 3 men walked out the shattered front door, leaving it hanging off its broken hinges. I sat in my office and watched the black SUV speed away down the manicured street, heavily weighed down by the spoils of my son's fake life. I switched the camera feed back to the grand foyer. Justin was standing completely alone in a hollowed-out mansion. The expensive furniture, the art, the electronics. Everything that made up the illusion of his success was entirely gone. He was standing in a massive empty wooden box, realizing for the first time in his life that without my money, he was absolutely nothing. It took exactly 48 hours for Vanessa to finally be released from the county holding cell. Because my son Justin had his illicit wire transfer frozen by federal banking authorities, he had absolutely no way to pay her bail. Vanessa was forced to use her one allowed phone call to contact her own parents. Her parents are retired and live on a fixed income in a different state. They had to drain their modest savings accounts to secure her release. When Vanessa finally walked out of the police precinct, she was exhausted, humiliated, and completely enraged. She took a cheap taxi back to the gated community, expecting to return to her luxurious sanctuary to recover from the trauma of her arrest. She walked through the shattered front door and stepped into an absolute nightmare. The grand foyer was completely bare. The massive living room was a hollow wooden box. The designer furniture, the expensive artwork, the imported espresso machines, and every single piece of her precious jewelry was completely gone. Justin was sitting on the bare hardwood floor in the empty living room. He had no choice but to confess the entire brutal reality to his wife. He had to tell her that I had cut off the corporate credit. He had to tell her about the frozen wire transfer. But the most devastating blow was admitting that the piece of paper in their wall safe was not a property deed. He had to look his wife in the eye and admit that they were legally nothing more than tenants living in a house owned entirely by my corporate trust. Most normal people faced with this overwhelming collapse would realize the game was over. They would pack whatever clothes they had left, apologize for their massive mistakes, and try to start over quietly. But Justin and Vanessa are not normal people. They are deeply entitled individuals who believe the world owes them an endless supply of luxury. Instead of turning on each other, they united in a toxic bond of pure vengeance. They decided that if they could not legally own the multi-million-dollar estate, they were going to systematically destroy it. Their first calculated move was to weaponize the legal system against me. They knew that property laws heavily favor the occupants, even when those occupants are completely hostile. The trust agreement required them to pay a nominal maintenance fee every month to maintain their legal status as authorized tenants. Justin formally sent an email to my proxy attorney, Nolan Foster, explicitly refusing to pay the fee. By actively defaulting on the tenancy agreement, they officially transitioned from authorized residents to hostile squatters. In their minds, this was a brilliant tactical maneuver. They knew that a civil eviction process can drag out for 6 months to a year in the overcrowded housing courts. They believed they had secured a massive empty fortress where they could live rent-free while inflicting maximum damage on my property. Vanessa then reverted to the only skill she actually possessed. She turned to social media to manipulate the emotions of strangers. She went to a local pharmacy and bought a cheap plastic phone tripod. She set it up in the center of the empty, echoing living room. She did not bother to clean herself up. She wore the same wrinkled sweatpants she had worn in the county jail. She purposely rubbed dirt on her face and messed up her hair to look as pathetic and victimized as possible. She hit the live broadcast button and began streaming to her hundreds of thousands of internet followers. I sat in my quiet office at the logistics yard and watched the live feed on my secondary computer monitor. I watched Vanessa look directly into the camera and begin to violently sob. She spun a masterfully fabricated story of absolute tragedy. She told her gullible fans that her cruel billionaire father-in-law had suddenly gone insane and violently evicted them without warning. She claimed that I had sent armed thugs to their house in the middle of the night to steal all of their belongings and leave them destitute on the street. She painted herself as an innocent female entrepreneur whose wellness brand was being maliciously destroyed by a greedy, abusive patriarch. Then she escalated the performance. She picked up a heavy steel crowbar she had found in the garage. While the camera was rolling, she walked over to the custom Brazilian cherry hardwood floors that I had paid $30,000 to have installed. She drove the sharp end of the crowbar into the seams of the wood and began violently prying the expensive planks right off the subfloor. The wood splintered and cracked, loudly echoing through the empty house. She told her audience that they were literally tearing the house apart just to find scrap materials to survive. It was a completely absurd theatrical display, but the internet thrives on outrage. She pinned a link to the top of the video chat, urging her fans to donate to an emergency crowdfund. She begged for money to help them hire lawyers to fight my supposed abuse and to help them find a new place to live. I watched the donation counter on the side of the screen begin to rapidly tick upward. $5 here, $20 there. Thousands of strangers were eagerly handing over their hard-earned money to support a woman who had just been arrested for felony insurance fraud. Justin was standing off camera, periodically handing her a bottle of water, cheering her on as they monetized their own self-destruction. Watching someone intentionally destroy a beautiful piece of architecture would normally invoke a response of extreme anger. But I felt absolutely nothing. Hardwood floors are just wood and nails. The entire property is heavily insured by a premium corporate policy. Let them swing the crowbar. Let them throw their tantrum. I did not care about the floors. My attention was entirely focused on something else. While Vanessa was moving around the room, swinging the heavy steel tool, the camera angle shifted slightly. The background of the video frame now revealed the lower-level hallway leading toward the basement entrance. 6 months ago, Vanessa had casually mentioned that her organic cosmetic business was expanding and she needed more climate-controlled storage space for her inventory. I had completely ignored the comment at the time, but as I looked closely at the background of the live video, I realized that the physical layout of the hallway looked completely wrong. I am a man who builds things. I have memorized the architectural blueprints for every single property I own. According to the original structural plans, there was supposed to be a massive load-bearing wall separating the hallway from the lower basement recreation room. That wall was designed to hold the structural weight of the entire second-floor master suite. The wall was completely gone. In its place was a massive open space filled with heavy, unpermitted commercial refrigeration units that Vanessa was using to store her custom creams and lotions. She had clearly hired cheap, unlicensed contractors, paid them in cash, and ordered them to knock down a critical structural support pillar simply to make room for her fake business inventory. She had compromised the structural integrity of the entire multi-million-dollar home. Vanessa thought she was brilliant. She thought she was building a massive financial war chest with her crowdfund while hiding behind the slow protections of the civil housing court. She believed it would take me a year to legally remove her from the premises. She fundamentally misunderstood how power works in the real world. You do not fight a squatter in a slow civil court. You fight them with the immediate ruthless power of municipal bureaucracy. The destruction of the hardwood floors was annoying, but the removal of a load-bearing wall without a city permit is a severe public safety hazard. I did not call my lawyer, and I did not call the local police. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the direct emergency line for the City Zoning and Structural Integrity Commission. I provided my corporate identification and calmly reported a critical collapse risk at my property. I informed the city inspectors that the occupants had illegally destroyed the foundational supports and that the building was no longer safe for human habitation. The bureaucratic machine was instantly activated, and it moves much faster than any civil court judge. It was exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. Justin and Vanessa were likely sleeping on the hard, cold wooden floor of their empty living room, wrapped in whatever cheap blankets they had managed to scrounge together. They were completely unprepared for the bureaucratic nightmare that was about to violently wake them up. They were suddenly startled by the sound of heavy fists pounding against the splintered remains of their front door. It was not Gavin Russo returning to extract more blood or take more furniture. It was a tactical team of municipal workers. 3 senior city zoning inspectors wearing high-visibility vests and hard hats stood on the front porch. They were heavily flanked by 2 armed county police officers. The lead inspector held a bright yellow clipboard containing an emergency administrative search warrant. Justin stumbled to the door, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, completely confused by the massive official presence on his doorstep. He tried to block the entryway, puffing out his chest and claiming they had absolutely no right to enter his private residence without a civil court order. The lead police officer simply placed a heavy hand on Justin's shoulder and physically moved him aside. The officer calmly explained that a civil court order is only required for a standard landlord and tenant eviction. However, an emergency structural integrity warrant completely overrides all tenant rights and basic privacy laws. The city had received a highly credible tip regarding a catastrophic collapse risk, and they were legally obligated by municipal code to investigate the premises immediately to prevent a potential mass casualty event. The 3 inspectors did not pause to look at the torn-up hardwood floors or the empty, echoing living room. They marched with absolute purpose straight toward the lower-level hallway. Justin and Vanessa chased after them, screaming about harassment and threatening to call their expensive lawyers. Their loud protests fell on completely deaf ears. The inspectors reached the basement staircase and walked down into the lower level. What they found was a textbook example of arrogant, negligent destruction. The lead inspector shined a high-powered, heavy-duty flashlight across the expansive basement ceiling. He pointed his bright beam directly at the massive wooden support joists spanning the entire width of the massive house. Right in the center, where a critical load-bearing wall should have been securely anchored to the solid concrete foundation, there was absolutely nothing. The wall had been completely eradicated. In its place, sitting directly under the unsupported, sagging wooden beams, were 4 massive stainless steel commercial refrigeration units. These were the exact units Vanessa had purchased to store her organic cosmetic inventory for her fake wellness brand. The inspector walked over to the heavy machines and checked the electrical wiring. They were illegally hardwired directly into the residential breaker box using cheap exposed cables that constituted a massive and immediate fire hazard. But the electrical fire hazard was the least of their structural problems. The lead inspector pulled out a digital laser measuring device and pointed it at the ceiling directly above the heavy refrigerators. He took a reading and shook his head in absolute disgust. He turned to Justin and Vanessa, who were standing on the bottom step, looking incredibly foolish. The inspector explained the basic, unyielding laws of physics to my 35-year-old son. He told them that a residential second-floor master suite, complete with a heavy custom stone bathtub and massive walk-in closets, weighs several tons. That massive weight requires direct vertical support to transfer the load down to the foundation. By knocking down that specific wall without consulting an engineer, Vanessa had removed the primary structural column holding up the center of the entire multi-million-dollar house. The inspector pointed his flashlight to a highly visible microfracture running along the main wooden beam. He stated clearly that the floor above them was currently sagging by 2 full inches. It was no longer a question of if the second floor would collapse, but exactly when it would cave in and crush everything beneath it. Vanessa tried to argue her way out of the situation. She claimed she had hired an independent contractor she found on the internet, and that the man had promised her it was perfectly safe to remove the drywall. The inspector did not care about her ridiculous excuses. He told her that ignorance of structural engineering is not a legal defense against gross property negligence. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a thick pad of heavy adhesive stickers. They were bright neon red. He peeled the backing off the first sticker and slapped it directly onto the stainless steel door of Vanessa's precious commercial refrigerator. He then marched heavily back up the stairs into the main living room and slapped another red sticker right on the center of the shattered front door. The large black letters printed on the neon red sticker read, "Condemned unfit for human habitation." The lead inspector turned to the police officers and officially declared the entire property a critical danger zone. The legal status of the house completely shifted in that exact moment. Justin and Vanessa were no longer hostile squatters fighting a slow civil eviction process. They were now actively trespassing inside a condemned municipal hazard zone. The lead police officer turned to my son and my daughter-in-law. He did not read them their rights, but he gave them a direct lawful order that carried the full weight of the county government. He told them they had exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings they could carry in their bare hands and immediately vacate the premises. If they were still standing anywhere inside the structure when the 10-minute timer expired, they would both be arrested on the spot for criminal trespassing and reckless endangerment. Vanessa burst into hysterical tears. She dropped to her knees on the ruined hardwood floors, begging the officers for just a few days to pack her cosmetic inventory and find a climate-controlled storage unit. The officer simply tapped the glass face of his wristwatch and told her she now had 9 minutes left. Absolute sheer panic completely took over their minds. Justin and Vanessa scrambled wildly through the empty house, grabbing whatever minor items the shadow financiers had left behind. They stuffed dirty, wrinkled clothes into cheap plastic garbage bags. Justin grabbed his useless dead laptop and a handful of meaningless mail. Vanessa tried to drag one of the heavy cosmetic boxes up the basement stairs, but it was much too heavy for her. She was forced to abandon her entire fake wellness brand inventory, leaving thousands of dollars of organic creams to rot in the condemned basement. They ran frantically through the hollow rooms, finally realizing they had absolutely nowhere to go and no vehicles to drive. The 10 minutes evaporated instantly. The police officers placed their hands on the hilts of their duty weapons and escorted them firmly out the front door. They walked them all the way down the long brick driveway to the edge of the public street. The city inspectors stretched thick yellow caution tape across the brick pillars of the driveway, effectively sealing the property off from the rest of the world. Heavy metal padlocks were placed on the exterior gates. I sat in my office at the logistics yard, watching the entire humiliating process unfold on my exterior security cameras. I watched my son and his wife stand on the public sidewalk, holding cheap plastic garbage bags filled with dirty clothes. The morning sun was bright, but their reality was incredibly dark. In less than 48 hours, they had gone from projecting the image of an elite wealthy couple hosting lavish influencer parties to standing on a suburban curb with absolutely nothing to their names. They could not go back inside the house. They could not access any corporate bank accounts. They could not start the luxury car sitting completely dead in my driveway. The slow civil housing court they had arrogantly planned to exploit had been completely bypassed by a single phone call from a man who understands exactly how to pull the right administrative levers. The squatters' stand was completely broken, and they were now officially and utterly homeless. Justin and Vanessa were now operating out of a cheap roadside motel located right off the interstate highway. The small room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. It was a massive fall from the pristine environment of their custom modern farmhouse, but Vanessa did not let the bleak surroundings stop her digital performance. She propped her smartphone against a stained plastic ice bucket and continued to broadcast her fabricated misery to the world. Over the next 72 hours, her emergency crowdfund completely exploded. The total amount raised bypassed $50,000, then $100,000, and eventually crossed the $200,000 mark. To generate that kind of money, Vanessa had to escalate her lies into absolute severe defamation. I watched her live videos from the quiet comfort of my office at the logistics yard. She looked directly into the camera lens and told her hundreds of thousands of followers that I had physically threatened her. She claimed I had bribed city officials to illegally condemn their home. She spun a completely insane narrative that I was a corrupt billionaire patriarch trying to destroy a successful independent woman simply because she refused to obey my tyrannical household rules. Every single word she spoke was a documented, publicly broadcasted lie. She was actively monetizing defamation of character and committing massive wire fraud by soliciting funds from innocent people under false pretenses. Most men in my position would have immediately sent a cease and desist letter the moment their family name was dragged through the mud on the internet. But I am an architect of consequences, and I understand how to build a permanent trap. I did not contact the social media platform to take the videos down. I deliberately let the campaign run. In the realm of financial crimes, the severity of the federal penalty is directly tied to the total monetary value of the fraud. By allowing the crowdfund to swell past $200,000, Vanessa had elevated her crime from a minor state misdemeanor to a massive multi-count federal felony. I let them climb as high as possible so the inevitable fall would shatter them completely. Justin did not care about the severe legal implications of his wife's digital lies. He was entirely consumed by raw, primal fear. He knew that Gavin Russo was still out there operating in the shadows of the city. He knew the shadow financier would soon realize the stolen living room furniture and the designer jewelry did not fully cover the massive gambling debt and the exorbitant underground interest rates. Justin looked at the $200,000 sitting in that crowdfunding account and saw his ultimate salvation. He saw a one-way ticket completely out of the state. He planned to withdraw the entire sum in untraceable cash, abandon whatever remained of his fake life, and disappear across the border before Russo could send his massive enforcers to the cheap roadside motel. On Tuesday morning, Justin and Vanessa decided it was finally time to cash out. They took a local public transit bus to a massive commercial bank branch situated in the wealthy downtown financial district. They walked through the heavy glass doors, completely ignoring the fact that they looked entirely out of place. They were wearing the same wrinkled, unwashed clothes they had salvaged from their condemned house. However, they carried themselves with the arrogant swagger of lottery winners. They genuinely believed they had successfully manipulated the internet and outsmarted my entire corporate legal team. They marched directly past the regular customer line and demanded to speak with a premium account specialist. A polite young teller guided them to a private desk and asked how she could assist them. Vanessa proudly placed her smartphone on the desk, displaying the crowdfunding account dashboard, with the massive $200,000 balance. She formally requested a full, immediate withdrawal of all available funds. She demanded that $50,000 be dispensed in physical cash and the remainder be transferred to a new secure offshore routing number that Justin had hastily procured on the internet. The teller maintained a polite, professional smile and began typing the account credentials into her secure terminal. Justin stood nervously tapping his foot against the polished marble floor, looking over his shoulder toward the bank entrance. He was constantly checking the street through the large glass windows, searching for the black armored vehicle belonging to Gavin Russo. Every passing delivery truck made his heart race. He just needed the physical cash in his hands so they could finally run and escape the violent consequences of his gambling addiction. The teller pressed the enter key to process the massive withdrawal. Her polite customer service smile instantly vanished. She stared at her computer monitor, and her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She typed the specific sequence of routing numbers again, believing she had made a simple clerical error. A bright red warning banner flashed across her internal banking screen. It was a Level 1 federal asset hold. The teller nervously adjusted her collar and looked up at Justin and Vanessa. She did not explain the exact nature of the problem. She simply stated that a transaction of this massive magnitude required secondary authorization from the branch manager. She stood up from her desk, apologizing for the brief delay, and quickly walked away toward the secure administrative offices located at the back of the banking floor. Justin immediately felt the cold grip of panic tighten around his chest. His survival instincts, developed from months of dodging creditors, told him that something was catastrophically wrong. He whispered urgently to Vanessa that they should leave the bank immediately and try a different branch later in the afternoon. But Vanessa was completely blinded by her own greed. She absolutely refused to leave the $200,000 behind. She firmly told Justin to stay put, claiming it was just standard banking protocol for large cash withdrawals and that he was being overly paranoid. They sat at the desk for 5 agonizing minutes. The heavy mahogany door of the branch manager's office finally clicked open. Justin exhaled a breath of relief, expecting to see a bank executive holding a stack of cashier checks and a canvas bag of printed currency. But the man who stepped out of the office was not wearing a standard bank uniform. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit and carrying a thick black leather briefcase. It was Nolan Foster. My ruthless corporate proxy attorney had been tracking their digital financial movements since the exact second the crowdfund was created. Nolan did not walk toward them with a friendly greeting. He marched across the polished marble floor, projecting absolute legal authority. He stopped directly in front of the desk where Justin and Vanessa were sitting. He unlatched his heavy briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of thick legal injunctions, dropping them loudly onto the desk right next to Vanessa's phone. I sat at my desk in the logistics yard looking out over the rows of heavy machinery. My secure phone line was open. Nolan Foster was wearing a discreet earpiece while he stood over my son and my daughter-in-law in the center of the upscale downtown bank. Through the audio connection, I could hear the ambient sounds of the banking floor. I could hear the quiet murmur of wealthy clients and the clicking of keyboards. I was listening live as Nolan delivered the final devastating blow to their pathetic escape plan. The young bank teller had completely stepped away, retreating behind the bulletproof glass of the main counter. Justin and Vanessa were left sitting in the plush leather chairs, staring up at the man holding their financial execution orders. Nolan unlatched his heavy black briefcase. He did not pull out a cashier check. He pulled out a massive stack of thick legal injunctions and dropped them squarely onto the desk right next to Vanessa's phone. The heavy thud echoed across the quiet marble floor. Vanessa tried to maintain her arrogant facade. She demanded to know who he was and what he was doing interrupting her transaction. She threatened to call the police, completely forgetting she was already out on bail for a felony. Nolan did not flinch. He looked at her with the cold, dead eyes of a corporate shark who had destroyed companies worth 10 times more than her pathetic crowdfund. He leaned forward and delivered the truth. "The platform froze your campaign," Nolan stated. His voice was perfectly level, carrying the absolute authority of the law. "There is no money for you to withdraw today. There will be no money for you to withdraw tomorrow. The $200,000 you see on that screen is a digital ghost." Justin practically jumped out of his chair. He started stammering, arguing that the money belonged to them, that it was freely donated by their loyal followers, and that the bank had no legal right to withhold private funds. Nolan calmly reached out and tapped the top document on the stack he had just dropped on the desk. He told Justin to sit down and shut up. He then proceeded to systematically outline exactly how he had dismantled their escape plan. Nolan explained that crowdfunding platforms are legally classified as financial institutions. They are bound by strict federal anti-fraud statutes and anti-money laundering regulations. They do not operate in a vacuum. Early this morning, acting as my legal proxy, Nolan had served the platform legal department with a comprehensive dossier of their recent criminal activities. He slid the first document across the desk. It was a certified copy of the police report detailing Vanessa Fake's stolen vehicle claim. Nolan explained that soliciting donations from the public by claiming you are the victim of a violent crime when you are currently facing felony charges for fabricating that exact crime constitutes massive wire fraud. The internet platform relies on public trust to operate. The moment they realize a user is actively running a criminal scam on their servers, they immediately initiate a lockdown protocol to protect their own corporate liability. He slid the second document forward. It was the neon red city condemnation notice. Nolan told them he had provided the platform with irrefutable proof that they were not violently evicted by an abusive billionaire. He proved they were legally removed from the premises by the municipal government because Vanessa had recklessly destroyed a load-bearing wall, endangering the entire neighborhood. He proved their entire sob story was a calculated, documented lie. Then Nolan saved the most devastating piece of evidence for last. He pulled out a thick forensic accounting report generated by my artificial intelligence security system. He slid it directly in front of Justin. Nolan looked my son in the eye and told him about the dormant legacy payroll account. He detailed the exact timestamp when Justin had used a duplicated digital signature stamp to attempt to steal $60,000. He explained that because Justin had attempted to commit corporate embezzlement across state lines, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was now actively involved. Nolan told them that the moment the crowdfunding platform legal team saw the evidence of an ongoing federal investigation into wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, they panicked. Under federal law, if a platform knowingly facilitates the transfer of funds generated through criminal deception, they can be held as an accessory to money laundering. The platform instantly locked the account to protect themselves from a massive federal audit. Vanessa grabbed her phone and desperately refreshed the application. The screen refreshed, but the $200,000 balance was gone. In its place was a stark gray banner stating the account was under administrative review and all funds were locked indefinitely pending law enforcement action. She began to hyperventilate, the reality of her total defeat finally crushing her chest. She realized she had publicly humiliated herself, destroyed a multi-million-dollar home, and committed federal crimes, all for absolutely nothing. The money was trapped in a federal holding account, and it would eventually be refunded to the donors once the fraud investigation concluded. Furthermore, her internet followers would soon receive automated emails informing them that the campaign was fraudulent. Her entire digital identity and social status were permanently destroyed. Nolan picked up his empty briefcase and fastened the latches. He looked down at the two of them sitting in their dirty, wrinkled clothes in the middle of the pristine bank. They smelled of stale motel room air and cheap desperation. He delivered my final message. He told them that I had given them peace. I had removed myself completely from their lives just as they had requested. But peace does not mean freedom from consequences. Nolan turned and walked out of the bank, leaving them entirely alone. I ended the call from my office, satisfied with the surgical precision of the operation. The bank manager approached Justin and Vanessa a few moments later, flanked by an armed security guard. The manager politely but firmly informed them that their accounts were flagged. Their presence was disrupting banking operations, and they needed to vacate the premises immediately. Justin and Vanessa were escorted out of the heavy glass doors and back onto the hot, noisy downtown sidewalk. They stood on the concrete, the bustling city moving around them, completely oblivious to their massive downfall. They had no car. They had no home. They had no credit. And now their $200,000 escape fund had evaporated into thin air. They were trapped in the city, entirely exposed and completely broke. Justin stared blankly at the traffic, his mind completely broken by the sheer magnitude of his failures. He had tried to outsmart a man who built a national logistics empire, and he had been systematically crushed at every single turn. Suddenly, the silence between them was broken by a sharp, vibrating buzz coming from Justin's front pocket. He slowly reached into his pants and pulled out his smartphone. The screen was cracked from when he had dropped it during the frantic eviction from the house. A single text message notification glowed through the spiderweb of shattered glass. It was from an unregistered burner number, but Justin knew exactly who sent it. It was from Gavin Russo. The message was incredibly short, containing only 2 words that sealed his fate. Time is up. Justin was completely out of options. The digital world had entirely rejected him. Every bank account was frozen. Every credit card was deactivated. His social media empire had collapsed into a federal fraud investigation. He was standing on a busy city sidewalk with absolutely nothing but the wrinkled clothes on his back and a shattered smartphone displaying a deadly threat from Gavin Russo. When a man like Justin realizes he can no longer manipulate computer screens or bank tellers, he is forced to resort to base animal instincts. He needed physical, untraceable cash. He needed a massive amount of it, and he needed it before the sun came up. He wandered the city streets for hours, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He eventually remembered a very old secret from his childhood. Before I built a national logistics empire, before I owned massive concrete shipping yards, I owned a single neighborhood hardware store on the industrial edge of town. I never sold that original brick building. I kept it operational as a reminder of where I came from and the hard physical labor it took to build my life. Justin knew that in the back office of that store, bolted directly into the concrete foundation, there was a vintage heavy steel floor safe. He also knew that decades ago, before modern digital banking, I used to keep unregistered bearer bonds and emergency cash inside that exact vault. Justin assumed I was a nostalgic old man. He believed that because the hardware store was a relic of my past, I had left the security protocols in the past as well. He convinced himself that the untraceable paper wealth was still sitting in the dark, just waiting for someone desperate enough to take it. He did not have a car to drive, so he spent his last few dollars on a late-night public transit bus ticket. He left Vanessa crying in the cheap motel room and rode the empty bus all the way to the forgotten industrial district. The streets were completely deserted, illuminated only by flickering amber streetlights. He walked the last few blocks with his head down, terrified that Russo and his massive enforcers were hiding in the shadows, waiting to break his legs. He found a heavy, jagged piece of broken concrete in a vacant lot and carried it with him. He was no longer an elite entrepreneur. He was a common street burglar, preparing to rob his own father in the middle of the night. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, when Justin slipped into the dark, narrow alleyway behind my original hardware store. The building is an old, heavy brick structure with a reinforced steel service door at the rear. The door has a single square pane of thick security glass embedded near the handle. Justin stood in the dark alley, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. He gripped the heavy piece of concrete in his right hand. He took a deep, ragged breath, raised his arm, and smashed the concrete directly into the thick glass. The sound of shattering glass echoed loudly in the quiet alley. Justin froze, pressing his back against the rough brick wall, waiting to hear the piercing shriek of a commercial security alarm. He waited for 10 agonizing seconds. The alley remained completely silent. No sirens wailed. No floodlights snapped on. Justin exhaled a shaky breath, believing he had just bypassed a ridiculously outdated security system. He reached his arm through the jagged hole, carefully avoiding the sharp shards of glass, and turned the interior deadbolt. The heavy steel door creaked open, and my son stepped inside my property. The interior of the hardware store was pitch black, smelling heavily of cut lumber fertilizer and old machine oil. Justin did not dare to turn on his phone flashlight, fearing the light might be seen from the street. He moved blindly through the narrow aisles of the store, his hands tracing the metal shelving units to guide his path. He stumbled over a display of heavy steel chains and bit his lip to keep from crying out in pain. Every shadow looked like a waiting enforcer. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards sounded like approaching police footsteps. The journey from the back door to the rear administrative office took him nearly 15 minutes of pure psychological torture. He finally reached the solid oak door of my old office. He turned the brass knob and pushed it open. The office looked exactly as it had 20 years ago. My heavy wooden desk sat in the center of the room. A vintage filing cabinet rested in the corner. Justin dropped to his knees on the old faded rug covering the floor. He frantically pulled the rug back, exposing the cold concrete foundation. Right in the center, sitting flush with the floor, was the heavy circular steel door of the vintage safe. Justin wiped the nervous sweat from his eyes. His hands were shaking so violently he had to press them flat against the concrete to steady himself. He leaned over the safe, staring at the heavy brass combination dial. He squeezed his eyes shut, digging deep into his childhood memories, to recall the numerical sequence I had used decades ago. He remembered it. He reached out and grasped the cold brass dial. He turned it slowly to the right, listening to the heavy mechanical clicks echoing in the silent room. He paused, then spun it back to the left, hitting the second number. He carefully rotated it to the right one final time, stopping exactly on the final digit. He grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled upward. The internal locking bolt slid back with a loud, heavy clunk. The massive steel door swung open on its well-oiled hinges, revealing the deep, dark cavity hidden beneath the concrete floor. Justin leaned forward, his eyes wide with desperate anticipation. He expected to see thick stacks of crisp $100 bills and bundles of unregistered bearer bonds that would instantly solve all of his massive problems. He reached his trembling hand down into the vault, ready to grab his ultimate salvation. His fingers brushed against the cold, empty steel bottom. Justin froze. The safe was completely empty. There was absolutely no money. There were no paper bonds. The only thing sitting at the bottom of that dark, heavy vault was a small, square piece of black plastic. Justin squinted into the darkness, trying to understand what he was looking at. Embedded in the center of that small, black plastic square was a single, tiny red light emitting a steady, rhythmic blink. Justin stared down into the dark cavity of the vintage floor safe. His eyes were completely locked on that single, tiny red light, emitting its steady, rhythmic blink. For a few seconds, his exhausted mind simply could not comprehend what he was looking at. He had expected to see faded paper bonds and thick stacks of old currency. He had expected the relics of my past to save his immediate future. Instead, he was looking directly at a highly sophisticated digital trap. He slowly lowered his trembling hand into the vault, his fingers brushing against the cold, black plastic square. The moment his skin made contact with the device, the rhythmic blinking instantly shifted into a solid, burning red glare. He did not know that the old brass dial on the surface of the safe was completely irrelevant. It was nothing more than a mechanical decoy. The actual locking mechanism had been entirely gutted and replaced 5 years ago with a state-of-the-art biometric tripwire connected directly to my central security server. By opening the heavy steel door and breaking the internal laser plane, Justin had just triggered a maximum security lockdown protocol designed to protect high-value commercial inventory. The reaction of the building was absolutely instantaneous and violently loud. High above Justin, hidden within the drop ceiling of the old hardware store, massive electromagnetic latches simultaneously disengaged. A deafening mechanical roar ripped through the silent brick building. Heavy corrugated steel security shutters, which I had secretly installed behind the decorative exterior awnings, dropped like massive metallic guillotines. Justin scrambled backward, falling hard onto the dusty floor as the shutters slammed down over the front display windows, blocking out the faint amber glow of the streetlights. Another massive shutter crashed down over the rear service door, entirely covering the shattered glass pane he had crawled through just moments before. Thick titanium locking pins automatically fired outward from the bottom of the steel curtains, driving deep into pre-drilled holes in the concrete foundation. The entire perimeter of the building was instantly sealed tight. Justin was no longer standing inside a nostalgic neighborhood hardware store. He was locked inside a reinforced concrete and steel cage. Before he could even catch his breath, the darkness was violently eradicated. The overhead commercial fluorescent light fixtures snapped on row by row, flooding the store with a blinding, harsh white glare. Justin threw his hands over his face, squeezing his eyes shut against the sudden burning brightness. The quiet shadows he had relied upon to sneak into my property were completely stripped away, leaving him entirely exposed in the center of the wide open floor. Dust particles swirled heavily in the bright air, kicked up by the violent impact of the steel shutters. He scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving with pure animal panic. He ran frantically toward the front of the store, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the smooth old floorboards. He threw his entire body weight against the massive front shutter, beating his fists against the cold, unyielding steel. He screamed for help, but the heavy corrugated metal completely absorbed his voice. The building was heavily soundproofed for heavy machinery demonstrations. He ran back down the main aisle, knocking over displays of paint cans and heavy tools, desperately searching for another way out. He reached the rear service door and picked up the heavy piece of jagged concrete he had used to break in. He swung it with all his remaining strength against the metal shutter. The concrete block shattered into a dozen pieces, stinging his hands and falling uselessly to the floor. The steel curtain did not even dent. He was completely trapped. There were no secondary exits. There were no hidden windows. He dropped to his knees in the middle of the aisle, completely surrounded by the heavy merchandise of my past. He began to hyperventilate the reality of his absolute doom finally crushing his spirit. Then the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights was broken by a sharp crackle of static. High up in the corners of the room, the old public address intercom system snapped to life. I was sitting in my glass-walled office at the logistics yard, looking at the live high-definition security feed, broadcasting directly from the hardware store. I watched my son crawling on the floor like a cornered rat. I leaned forward and pressed the transmission button on my desktop microphone. My voice filled the bright, empty room, echoing off the brick walls and the steel shutters. I told him to stop running. I told him he was wasting his energy and embarrassing himself. Justin froze. He looked up at the ceiling, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute disbelief. He called out to me, his voice cracking with desperation, begging me to open the doors and let him go. He promised he would leave the state and never bother me again. He swore he just needed a little bit of cash to escape a man who was going to kill him. I kept my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotional warmth. I spoke clearly, ensuring every single word cut through his panic and settled deep into his mind. I told him that he had spent his entire life making fundamentally flawed assumptions. He assumed that because this hardware store was old, it was weak. He assumed that because I was his father, I would continually tolerate his disrespect and fund his criminal behavior. He assumed that when he demanded peace and told me to stay away from his life, I would simply retreat and quietly suffer his insults. I explained that a man who builds a national logistics empire from a single flatbed truck does not survive by leaving vulnerabilities in his foundation. I told him I never forget a single asset I own. The vintage floor safe was not a forgotten relic holding old money. It was a calculated trap specifically designed for an internal threat. I knew that if he ever became truly desperate and found himself locked out of the modern digital banking system, his greedy mind would inevitably wander back to the stories of my past. I deliberately left the old numerical combination exactly the same because I wanted him to be able to open that door. I needed him to step willingly into the exact center of my property and cross the final unforgivable line of his own free will. I built this empire on security, Justin, I said, my voice carrying the heavy weight of absolute finality. You thought my peace meant weakness. You thought my silence meant ignorance. You believed you could take my money, disrespect my home, and then rob me in the middle of the night without facing a single consequence. You wanted peace from my presence, but you felt entirely entitled to the fruits of my labor. I have finally granted you the absolute independence you have always wanted. You are now completely on your own, standing in a room that you cannot manipulate or buy your way out of. Justin collapsed onto his hands and knees, weeping openly against the cold floor. He knew I was right. He had exhausted every single lifeline and burned every bridge I had ever built for him. He pleaded with me one final time, asking what was going to happen to him and how he was going to survive Gavin Russo. I told him he no longer had to worry about Gavin Russo. The shadow financier was a problem for men who walk the streets as free citizens. Justin was no longer going to be a free citizen. Through the thick brick walls and the heavy steel shutters, a new sound began to penetrate the quiet industrial neighborhood. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail echoing off the empty concrete buildings. Justin stopped crying and raised his head. The sound grew rapidly louder, multiplying into a chorus of aggressive mechanical screams. I did not even have to pick up a phone to dial the local authorities. The biometric tripwire inside that safe was hardwired directly to the county police precinct dispatch board. Breaking that laser plane automatically generated a Priority 1 commercial burglary in progress alert. The wail of the police sirens grew deafeningly loud, completely surrounding the exterior of the hardware store. Harsh red and blue lights began flashing through the tiny gaps in the steel shutters, casting erratic shadows across Justin's pale, terrified face. The authorities had arrived in massive numbers, and they were preparing to firmly breach the building. The wail of the police sirens outside the hardware store abruptly stopped, replacing the high-pitched noise with the heavy rumbling of tactical transport engines. I watched the live security feed from my office as the county emergency response team deployed their heavy equipment. They did not attempt to pick the locks or negotiate. When a Priority 1 commercial alarm is triggered at a facility known to house heavy industrial equipment, the authorities treat the situation with maximum tactical force. Sparks began to shower wildly across the exterior security camera feeds. The tactical officers were using industrial-grade rotary saws with diamond-tipped blades to slice directly through the reinforced corrugated steel shutters I had dropped over the front entrances. The massive metallic screech of the blades tearing through the steel echoed loudly through the neighborhood. Inside the store, Justin was no longer running or screaming. He was sitting completely motionless on the dusty wooden floor right next to the open floor safe. The rhythmic blinking red light of the biometric tripwire cast a faint glow against his pale face. He watched the front shutter begin to buckle inward. The heavy steel curtain finally gave way, crashing violently onto the floorboards and kicking up a massive cloud of thick gray dust. 6 heavily armed tactical officers poured through the opening, their high-powered rifle lights piercing the dusty air and locking directly onto my son. They shouted commands demanding he show his hands and lay flat on the floor. Justin did not resist. He was completely physically and mentally broken. He slowly rolled onto his stomach and placed his hands behind his back. The officers moved in swiftly, pressing their heavy boots against his shoulders and securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic click of the restraints was the final sound of his absolute defeat. The lead detective entered the building a few moments later, reading Justin his rights and formally stating the charges. Because he had smashed a window to bypass a locked door and attempted to access a secure corporate vault, he was not being charged with a simple misdemeanor. He was officially arrested for felony commercial burglary, attempted corporate espionage, and felony destruction of private property. They hauled him up from the floor, dragged him out into the cold night air, and shoved him into the back of a waiting police cruiser. The next morning, the sun rose brightly over my logistics yard. I sat at my mahogany desk, drinking a cup of hot, black coffee. The chaos of the past 48 hours had completely settled into a perfect, absolute silence. My proxy attorney, Nolan Foster, sent me a brief encrypted message confirming that the operation was fully complete. The multi-million-dollar estate was securely padlocked and legally reclaimed by the trust. The fraudulent crowd fund was permanently seized by federal banking investigators. Vanessa was back in a county holding cell after her bail was officially revoked due to the newly discovered evidence of her structural property destruction and wire fraud. The massive threat of Gavin Russo had been entirely neutralized because the shadow financier had immediately gone into hiding the moment he realized the Federal Bureau of Investigation was now closely monitoring my family network. Every single loose end had been surgically tied off. At 10:00 in the morning, I put on a tailored charcoal suit and drove my personal vehicle to the county correctional facility. I did not go there to offer comfort or to negotiate a surrender. I went there to balance the final ledger. I walked through the heavy security checkpoints, emptying my pockets and passing through the metal detectors. The air inside the prison was cold and sterile, smelling heavily of institutional bleach and stale sweat. A corrections officer escorted me down a long concrete hallway to the secure visitation wing. I sat down in a small metal chair inside a narrow concrete booth. Separating me from the prisoner side was a thick wall of reinforced bulletproof glass. A few minutes later, a heavy steel door on the opposite side of the glass buzzed open. 2 guards escorted Justin into the room. He was wearing a bright orange standard-issue jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. The tailored silk shirts and the designer watches were gone. His hair was a greasy mess, and deep dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. He shuffled slowly toward the glass, looking like a hollow shell of the arrogant entrepreneur he had pretended to be just 2 days ago. He sat down in the metal chair opposite mine and immediately reached for the heavy black telephone receiver mounted on the wall. I picked up my receiver and held it to my ear. The audio connection crackled with a faint static. Justin looked at me through the thick glass and immediately began to weep. His voice trembled through the receiver, begging me to help him. He told me the public defender assigned to his case had informed him he was facing a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for the corporate espionage and wire fraud charges. He pleaded with me to hire Nolan Foster to represent him. He begged me to post his bail, promising he would check into a rehabilitation facility for his gambling addiction and work off his debt in my logistics yard for the rest of his life. He pressed his trembling hand against the bulletproof glass and called me Dad, telling me that family is supposed to forgive each other. I did not reach out to touch the glass. I did not raise my voice. I sat perfectly still looking at the man I had raised and financially supported for 35 years. I told him that he had fundamentally misunderstood the concept of family. I explained that family is a foundation built on mutual respect, honesty, and shared protection. Family is not a limitless bank account that you can exploit to fund a fake life and a massive gambling addiction. I reminded him of the text message he had sent me on Friday night. I repeated his exact words back to him. You told me not to come to your house anymore. You told me that my presence stressed your wife out. You explicitly demanded that I give you peace. I looked him dead in the eyes and watched the tears stream down his face. I told him that I am a man who always honors his contracts, and I had delivered exactly what he requested. I told him that I had secured the peace. My legacy is now entirely protected from his reckless greed. My corporate assets are completely airtight and secured by the best legal minds in the country. The multi-million-dollar estate is empty and waiting to be repaired. And most importantly, my life is now completely free of the parasites that were quietly draining my resources and disrespecting my name. Justin opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The absolute finality of my voice completely crushed whatever tiny sliver of hope he had left. He realized in that exact moment that I was not there to rescue him. I was there to close the account. I was there to look him in the eye and officially terminate his position in my life. I told him that the public defender was a highly capable attorney, and I wished him the best of luck with his upcoming federal trial. I did not wait for him to respond. I did not want to hear another fabricated apology or another desperate excuse. I slowly placed the heavy black receiver back onto the metal hook, completely severing the audio connection between us. Justin slammed his hands against the thick glass, screaming silently through the reinforced barrier, but I could no longer hear him. I stood up from the metal chair, adjusted my suit jacket, and turned my back on him. I walked out of the sterile visitation booth and back down the long concrete hallway. I retrieved my personal belongings from the security desk and pushed through the heavy double doors leading out of the county correctional facility. I stepped out into the bright morning sun. The crisp air filled my lungs, and a profound sense of absolute clarity washed over me. The surgical eradication was completely finished. The rot had been entirely excised from the foundation of my empire. I walked toward my car, ready to return to my logistics yard and continue building my legacy without the heavy burden of an ungrateful son. The ledger was finally perfectly balanced. As I reflect on the wreckage of my son's life, the most profound lesson I learned is that true parental love sometimes requires absolute, uncompromising destruction. We do our children a massive disservice when we cushion every fall and write a check for every mistake. Entitlement is a dangerous parasite that feeds exclusively on parental guilt and financial enabling. By granting Justin the peace he arrogantly demanded, I didn't just protect my corporate legacy, I forced him to finally face the man he actually was, completely stripped of the illusion of my wealth. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are the ultimate test of reality, and a firmly closed door is often the most valuable gift a father can ever give. If this story resonated with you, please share your own experiences of setting hard financial boundaries with entitled family members in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more lessons on protecting your peace and your legacy.